Help us to hear your voice, to understand your will, and to walk on your paths. Lord, may you speak to us now, whether through me or in spite of me, that we may be inspired to live more devout and faithful lives to you and your cause. For this we pray. Amen. So today we start a sermon series, a shortened, abbreviated sermon series on the book of Job. The book of Job is not one of those books that often gets a whole lot of attention in the preaching cycles. It's got some kind of problems in it, some problematic theology. But there's still some good and wonderful, I'm going to say, truths that we can pull from Job. Now, as we begin this series, I need you to understand a couple things about the book of Job. The book of Job is not considered to be a history. It is considered wisdom literature. That means that in all likelihood, it is a story that was made up to tell or teach fundamental principles of wisdom and knowledge. So it's kind of like a parable in that sense. That would mean that there probably was not actually a man named Job that suffered and endured all of the things that we just heard him suffer and endure. We also can look at it as being a story because what human on earth has been able to see the court of heaven and know when the angels are all gathering together and what God may be saying to Satan there. Chances are that is just a way that people probably tried to explain what was going on with how Job felt. I mean, if we think about it, how many times have we, if we're truly honest, probably felt in our own lives that we've been doing things right, we've been living pretty well, and then a whole bunch of stuff goes wrong, and we're like, why me? You know, God, are you sitting there playing some kind of game? Are you suddenly deciding to punish me or something? And so, I think it's from that sense that the author of Job is kind of writing about this scene in heaven where we see that God is kind of sitting there convening with the angels, and Satan comes up and he says to Satan, "Where have you been?" And Satan's like, "I've been wandering about the earth." And then God's like, "Well, have you seen my servant Job? I mean, he's such a great and wonderful guy. He's completely faithful and devout. He fears God. He fears me, and he turns away from evil, and he's blameless and upright. I mean, he's just like the greatest guy ever to walk the face of the earth." And Satan's like, "Well, yeah, because you've been protecting him. He hasn't ever struggled. He doesn't know how hard life can be. So of course he thinks you're the greatest thing ever. Of course he has no reason to sin. Just start taking some of that stuff away and see how faithful he is." And God's like, "All right, go ahead, take whatever away from him you want." And so Satan says, "Yes." And he goes down there, and we kind of heard the beginning of the story there. He takes all the stuff away and so on and so forth. And then Job, instead of being upset that he's just lost his children, all 10 of his children, that he's just lost his job and stuff like that, Job praises God and thanks God for his blessings. I think we can all admit that is probably not an actual human response. They are just trying to show how good Job was, and it's a little exaggerated. I think we can also admit that God is probably not as sadistic as saying, "Oh, here's my good and faithful servant. Go ahead, Satan, do your worst to them. Just go ahead and see if you can tempt him away or her away." That doesn't sound a lot like the God that we hear about in Jesus. But it does sound like the God that sometimes we feel may exist, especially when we're in the midst of having all that stuff go wrong. So here's our story of Job. As we just heard, Job is this man who is upright, and it says he is the greatest of all men in the East. And he has 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, and each day of the week the sons host a feast at their house, and they invite the sisters to come on over and all their brothers, and they all feast together and celebrate. And Job has grown exceedingly rich, and he has this huge farm filled with all of these animals. And Job is such a great guy that every week he actually prays for his children, and he offers up sacrifices for his children just in case they may have sinned that week. Not that they did, but Job is so devout and loves God and his children so much that he wants to make sure that they're covered for any sins that they might have committed. Even the ones that just were in their head. So this is this amazing and great guy. And then, if we follow the story, we hear that God and Satan kind of begin to make a bet. Satan's like, well, he's only such a great guy because you've never tested him. Take all that stuff away and he'll curse your name. God's like, all right, go ahead. So Satan does. He takes it all away. We hear that in the course of, well, probably 15 minutes, because it says that while they're still speaking, the next one comes. 4 servants come and tell Job, hey, I was out in the field with all of your cattle. And, the army from the country next door, they came and they took them all. And they killed all the other servants. And then the next guy's like, well, wait a minute, I got some more stories to tell you too. Like, I was out in the field with the sheep, and the fire came down from heaven and burned up all your sheep and all the other servants in the field that I was in. And then the third guy's like, wait, I was out in the field with the camels, and the other army from the other country over here, they came and they stole all your camels, and they killed all your people over here. And then the last servant's like, I was serving wine in your children's house, and the house fell down, and all your children are dead. Back to back to back. Everything that he has, all of his wealth, gone. His children, all 10 of them, gone at one time. Imagine holding a funeral for your 10 children. He's suffering, and he's in mourning. But it says that in his sorrow, he rips off all of his clothes, and he shaves off all of his hair, and he gets down and he thanks God. Thank you, God, for giving them to me while I had them. I'm sad that they're gone, but I'm glad that you gave them to me. I'm glad I had them for while they were here. So God and Satan come back together. God's like, see, I told you. I told you that taking away his stuff wouldn't affect his devotion to me. And Satan's like, well, yeah, but you only had me take away the material stuff. And not everyone really cares that much about material stuff. I mean, sure, he liked his farm, and I'm sure he loved his kids. But God, if you would just let me inflict some diseases on him, I guarantee you he will curse your name, take away his health, and that will really get him. And God's like, yeah, I don't think so go ahead and try. So Satan comes back down, and Satan smites Job with these diseases. And it says that Job ends up having open sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. So he's bleeding and infected. And then if we actually know from the rest of the story that he's given a bone disease, and so he's crippled, and he's given like stroke-like symptoms, and so his face is disfigured, and he's in constant pain and agony, and he itches everywhere, and he can't stop the scratching, and he's bleeding all over the place, and he's having a hard time keeping the food in his body, and he becomes excessively thin, and he's just not having a good run of it. And so he goes and sits down on a pile of ashes. And then, what you don't hear in our story is his wife comes out and finds him on the pile of ashes, and she's like, yeah, you've lost everything. And look at you now. That's pretty pathetic. Why don't you just go ahead and curse God so he'll kill you and, we can be done with this all. And she basically leaves him. His own wife, after all of this, is like, yeah, just go ahead and curse God so that he'll kill you. And I can be out. See you later. I don't want anything to do with you anymore. Goodbye. His job, his wealth, his home, his kids, his wife. I mean, if this is a country song, we can assume that she drove off in his pickup truck with his dog in the back. He's not having a good run. And yet he still remains faithful. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at Job's reaction, Job's struggle with all of this. And despite all of this bad stuff happening, we're going to see how Job remains faithful. But we're also going to see how Job is very much human. That in this struggle, and even through his faith, Job still endures depression. He endures anger at God. He has friends that are telling him to do things differently, and that if he just lived a little bit differently, none of this would have happened. He's got friends that are like, well, clearly you weren't so great, because if you were so great, this wouldn't have happened to you, and bad things don't happen to good people. But I think that's what the power of the story of Job is. It's a story about how bad things actually do happen to good people. And it's not because there is God and Satan up in the heavens playing some kind of weird game where, okay, so you've been really good, so go ahead and mess with this person now. Instead, I think it's just that things happen. And as we'll learn from Job, how we react to that has a lot to say about how we're going to see the world, how we're going to deal with it. And if we can learn from Job anything, it's that if we stick with God and stick with our faith, we're going to find out in the end that God has the power to restore all things, to make all things right, even when the world is turned upside down. So over the next couple weeks, I invite you to journey with me through our story of Job and to hear about a man who had everything and lost it all, but maintained his faith. And the difference that made for him in his life. And I hope that in hearing the story, it encourages you to find strength to trust into God, even when things don't seem so great. Even when you're at that point of, why me? Why could you be doing this to me, God? Why are you punishing me? Because the truth is God isn't sitting here punishing us. Instead, God is walking beside us through this all. God is there beside Job on his pile of ashes. And he's beginning to understand Job, beginning to really sympathize and feel with Job. And when it all comes down to it, and Job gets to stand face to face with God, he gets to know a God that really was there all along, a God that really does know him, that didn't abandon him, but that was listening, that was hurting alongside of him, and a God that is able to know his heart's desires and to make it all right again. And I think that it's that story, even though this comes from the Old Testament, it's the story that Jesus is trying to tell us that even in the worst of cases, even in the greatest of sufferings, and as he says, all of those who follow me will suffer, God still can make it right. So for now, let's take some time to sympathize with Job, to recognize that each of us may be a little bit like Job in our own lives at some point. That we all probably have gone through times of struggles where we felt like we've lost everything, where we want to be depressed, where we want to be angry. And over the next couple of weeks, may we hear how even when we feel like that and when we're in those places, that we can still have faith. We can still acknowledge those feelings, and we can still come out all right in the end because of God. Amen.